Abuse is a much higher standard, and frankly, most of the cases that we deal with may involve facts that we believe really rise to the level of abuse, but courts are much more frequently going to decide the cases under the neglect statute. But certainly courts do find abuse in cases where a child has been sexually abused by a parent or perhaps by another relative in a way that the parent either knows or allows or perhaps facilitates, and also severe and repeated physical harm. Abandonment is also governed by Family Court Act 1012 F2, which references then the Social Services Law 384B5, which talks about a parent evincing intent to forego their parental rights by failing to visit or communicate. So simply failing to provide financial support is not abandonment. Abandonment is really looking at contact, visits, and what's really significant is that the quality of the contacts matters. So even a parent who visits sometimes with a child can be found to abandon that child if those visits are sporadic, if they are not substantial, if they don't ask questions of the child about what they're doing, if they're not planning for the child in other ways. There are parts of the social services law that also get into planning for the child and how that's required. So there are cases, even in the context of termination of parental rights, which is a much higher and more severe sort of standard, that have found permanent neglect when a parent had 13 visits over 3 years, but those visits were not substantial or sporadic visits. So then there's the similar basis under state law, which is one of the newer, which was one of the changes under TVPRA. And part of the change was to allow for things that were, that are seen by family courts as similar or analogous to neglect or abandonment, and that actually, children are in foster care for many of these reasons. So children are in foster care having been deemed destitute child, for example. New York State has a law, Social Services Law 371.3, and that law specifically and explicitly states that it's not, a destitute child is a child who is in a state of want or suffering, but explicitly not through the neglect of their parent. And we've, for years, been successful, and the family courts have granted special findings orders for children who are in foster care through the destitute child provision, and USCIS has approved many of those petitions. The child in those cases has no adult, has no caretaker in their home country, and has also been found not to be in their best interest to return. Similarly, extraordinary circumstances, which are most classically defined by this case, Bennett v. Jeffries, which is listed there, and that might be just very, very substantial time separation. In that case, I believe it was 7 years. A parent's inability to care for the child due to physical illness or mental illness, and a parent's death. Certainly an orphan child, but also if the child has, the only remaining parent in their home country is deceased, they have, it's not in their best interest to return, and that often too forms a similar basis. The key is that it's not about necessarily malfeasance. It's about the situation of the child and the protective nature of the statute and the fact that this is intended to protect and provide stability and permanency for children who lack resources, parental resources. A similar thing is voluntary placement, which in the foster care context frequently results in a child being placed into foster care. So, anything? Yeah. So once you've interviewed your child, you've determined that you do believe they qualify for special immigrant juvenile status based on the fact that reunification with at least one of their parents is not viable due to abuse, abandonment, neglect, or a similar basis. The next step is how do you get into family court to get this order? And again, returning to the idea that this is all about the permanency and stability of the child. So you're going into court to ensure that the child has an order. We're going to talk mostly about custody and guardianship, but an order that formalizes their relationship with a caretaker, with an adult caretaker who has the ability and responsibility to make decisions for them, to provide for them emotionally, to help them ensure their well-being, educational decisions, et cetera.